Good morning. Thank you for attending the Parent Virtual Conference. This morning, we have our speaker, Greg Hickey, and he's presenting on It's Perfectly Normal, Our Common Struggles with Mental Health. And I want to read his bio. So Greg obtained both his Bachelor's of Science in Psychology and his Master's of Science in Counseling Psychology degrees from Angelo State University. He is licensed through the state of Texas as a licensed professional counselor. And I like to add, too, he's a great one and he helps us here in our office all the time. He has 13 years experience in the coordination of local mental health services, primarily in the provisions of crisis service, case management, suicide prevention, post-vention and education services for underserved and forensic populations, and continuity of his care for individuals diagnosed with severe and persistent mental illnesses. He has extensive knowledge and training in evidence-based therapeutic interventions for depression, suicide thinking, anxiety, trauma, and psychosis. Currently, Greg serves as a mental health specialist here at Region 15, consulting and educating 45 school districts on matters of mental health in their schools. So we are lucky to have Greg here with us at our service center and today. So thanks, Greg. I'll hand the mic over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Monica. I really appreciate that introduction. I clearly have to cut down on the size of my intro. That's just too much. I appreciate you reading that, though. Good morning, everybody. I am super happy to be presenting here today. I always love talking to parents and kind of getting a feel for what you guys have going on out there, which, hopefully we get you involved in the conversation here today a little bit. This is a presentation that I like to call It's Perfectly Normal, Our Common Struggles with Mental Health. And I tried to be really intentional when I titled this presentation, simply because, as we're going to talk about today, we have a real problem in our society, especially out here in West Central Texas, really down south as a whole, where mental health is very much stigmatized. And I don't think we talk near enough about it. So my goal today is to talk through a few things that might give you some language that you can use to help destigmatize mental health yourself, but also recognize when somebody that you love and care about, including your kids, of course, are struggling with a mental health condition and might need help. And we'll talk about what that help looks like and make sure that you guys have my contact information so that if you ever need to get a hold of me, you can. And so we're going to go ahead and just dive right in because we've got a lot to cover today. I'm not going to go through who I am. Monica did a great job lining that out, but I will just say that this is the beginning of a conversation with y'all. It does not have to end here. I consider myself at your service as well, not just at the service of our teachers and educators. So if you guys ever need anything, if you've got questions, I love steering people towards resources and answering their mental health questions. Please reach out to me and let's talk about that. So what are we talking about today? Lots of ground to cover. We're going to talk about what mental health is, what mental illness is, and kind of the difference between the two, because we sometimes kind of lump the two together and don't really make those distinctions. But most importantly, we're going to talk about what you might need to be on the lookout for if your children and other loved ones are struggling. I also want to go through a little bit of information about how to best communicate with our children and the people that we love about their mental health concerns, teaching some basic self-management skills that might be helpful. And then if you are going to tune in later this week to my other session, which I think is on Thursday, we're going to talk a little more about managing our stress, but we'll talk a little bit about that today. And of course, where do we seek help? What resources do we have in Region 15 in our area to get our kiddo and really ourselves too help whenever we need that? So before we get started, anytime that I talk about mental health, I like to give this disclaimer. We are talking about some pretty sensitive topics today. And among those topics, we're going to talk a little bit about suicide prevention, which I know can be really sensitive for some folks. And really just anytime you talk about emotions and feelings and mental health, there may be some triggers in here emotionally for you that might be upsetting. And if at any point you guys have to step away, please do. This is going to be recorded. You can come back to it at a time when you can emotionally handle it and take care of yourself. So please don't feel like you have to sit through this if you're struggling. If you want these slides, I'm happy to send them to anybody who wants them. You can email me. You'll have my email address at the end if you want them to refer back to. We are not teaching people how to diagnose mental illness. So you are not going to leave this call a trained therapist by any means. We are not teaching you how to diagnose, but we are teaching you how to recognize signs and symptoms. Another important point, everything that we are talking about today applies not just to your kids, but also to adults as well. Most of what we talk about, in fact, are things that I think can benefit adults too if we apply them. So if you have any questions about how that works, just let me know. So what I want to do here is get you guys involved in the conversation a little bit. What I have here on the screen is what is just simply called a feelings wheel. Little do we know, we have over 150 words in the English language to describe our emotions, and we usually only stick to the 6 in the middle of this wheel. Happy or sad, scared, peaceful, joyful. We don't use some of these other feelings here. Now, what I love about this feelings wheel is it's organized. So when we think about the word sad, here kind of next to sad, we have several that are kind of linked, kind of related to sadness as an emotion. Things like shame and depression and loneliness and boredom. They're not exactly sadness, but they're related. Same thing with mad. Rather than just say we're mad, there are so many other things that we can say that are much more specific. I'm feeling hateful or hostile. Of course, underlying our madness and our anger, sometimes we have feelings of hurt and embarrassment or frustration or sarcasm. So anyway, you get the idea here. What I want to do is just you guys take a moment to check in with what you are feeling today. And if you feel like sharing that in the chat box or sharing it out loud, I'm going to invite you to do so. One thing that I would really like you to share, though, is in addition to how you're feeling, maybe give us a little bit of information about what your concerns are about the mental health of our children, and put that in the chat box as well. So 2 things in the chat box or out loud, what you're feeling today and what some of your concerns are. And I'll give you all a second to check in with yourselves there. All right, Romana says she's feeling optimistic. Wonderful. Rufina says she's feeling overwhelmed. Certainly something I hear frequently in my line of work. Virginia says she's feeling peaceful. I myself am feeling joyful and excited, if you can't tell. I always love presenting. Gets me all excited. Joyful and excited, 2 emotions, actually. And that's another point that I'd like to make, is that as human beings, sometimes we feel more than one emotion. So like Brenda says, she's feeling peaceful and relaxed. Absolutely. Monica says she is feeling thankful. Now, the reason why I do this, the reason I brought this up, feelings wheels, and you can also find feelings charts, are actually a strategy that you can use with children to help them identify what they're feeling, especially our little kiddos. They may not quite have the vocabulary yet that the older children do or adults have to describe their emotions. So they need a little bit of help. The reason why naming your emotions is so vitally important, not just as a kid, but as an adult as well, is because, as the age-old adage in psychology goes, if you can name it, you can tame it. And what we find looking at the research is that children who have a better grasp on their emotions and can name them out loud and kind of understand where they come from are actually better at managing their behavior than those children who aren't taught an emotional vocabulary from an early age. So one of the things that I'm going to challenge you guys to do, Spend some time looking at feelings wheels like this. Again, I'll send you the slides if you want them. You can use this one. Get to know those emotion words, teach them to your kiddos, and spend some time every day, not just identifying what you're feeling and checking in with your mood, but helping children check in with theirs as well. So we're going to talk a little bit more as we go along today about emotions and the role that they play in our mental health. Did anybody have any concerns that they wanted to voice before we got started today about mental health, or just burning questions that you have that I might be able to answer as we go along today?
I would like to share one of my concerns, or one of the things that I like to learn about this, because then we can share with the parents. Even though we invite parents to be in the sessions, sometimes there's barriers and they can't be here, but I'm really excited that we can learn, and then we can pass the information to them when it comes up in their own comfortable place, and in the setting or the situation that they're in. So my concern is, do I have enough to share? So that's why I'm here.
Yeah. Oh, we're going to give you plenty to share, Romana. Absolutely. And I appreciate the work you're doing in the community with our parents. So we will certainly give you plenty that you can share out. Anybody else?
I just wanted to add that with some families, it's I like the idea of helping them learn to identify feelings, because I noticed that with a lot of families, even though that they're aware that a family member may have or may be struggling with mental illness, they tend to avoid it.
Mm. Yeah.
Because I think they feel kind of like Ramona said, sometimes we feel like, I think especially with the parent, they feel like inadequate. They don't know how to handle that issue with the mental illness, so they avoid it.
Yeah.
And sometimes, like you were saying, Greg, a lot of times because they're avoiding it, then the child's behavior gets worse, because I feel like they're acting out because they're asking for help. Then the parent doesn't know how to help, so they just avoid it and deal with the misbehavior or whatever all day.
Really good point, Virginia. And
Yes.
That you sent? Oh,
Yes.
okay, so I had already started. I'll delete
Yeah.
it. Sorry.
And then they just sent me,
I think somebody wasn't muted, but they're muted now. So Virginia, you make really good points there. And really, the identification of emotions is just kind of part of the battle when it comes to helping kids regulate. It's also vitally important that parents kind of know how to regulate their own communication, which is something that we're going to talk about in greater detail here. But first, before we dive into those things, I want to kind of define what mental health and mental illness are, because sometimes we forget that we all have mental health. When we talk about mental health, usually it's in the context of something negative, right? Like, oh, they have a mental health problem, or he or she is MHMR, and we attach that label to the person. But we all have mental health, and what's important to know is that mental health changes from day to day, and it impacts our emotional world, our psychological world, but also how we relate to other people, our social well-being, as we would call that. And it affects how we think about ourselves, how we think about other people, how we think about the world in general. And that in turn affects how we feel inside. So underneath every emotion, there are thoughts and images sometimes that are sometimes troubling, sometimes joyful. And that impacts how we act. And our thoughts and our feelings and our actions are always kind of interacting with each other. And so we need to realize that how we take care of our mental health is going to impact our day-to-day mood and our social connections, and how we get along at work, and how kids get along at school. And our mental health is always changing, day by day, honestly, hour by hour, depending on what kind of day you're having. And it's affected by just how much stress you go through, but also, and this is vitally important, what your resources for coping are. And one of the most powerful resources that a child can have is one caring adult who is willing to listen non-judgmentally when they're struggling, teach them that emotional vocabulary, and be patient with them while they are kind of learning how to manage their own the behaviors. And so we're going to talk today about being that adult and being essentially that lighthouse for a kid who is really, really struggling. So your mental health is always changing day to day, minute to minute, based on what's got you stressed out and what resources you have available to cope. So another way to think about mental health, it exists on what I like to call a continuum. And what I mean by continuum is simply that it's always changing. And there are areas of your mental health that just simply require self-care and social support in order to function well. But sometimes we reach a place where we need professional care. I really like this graphic because it shows that mental health exists on that continuum, but it also describes in great detail when it might be time to seek professional help. So it's a great kind of altogether graphic here. So when we are normally functioning, when we are healthy, essentially we have normal mood fluctuations because our mood's always going to change. That's a normal part of being a human being. But generally speaking, we can take things in stride whenever bad things come along, whenever we're struggling with stress. We are usually pretty consistent in our performance, however that looks at school or at work. We're getting enough sleep. We've got some pretty normal sleep patterns there, and we stay relatively physically and socially active. We are generally confident enough to make it through our day, and we're just comfortable around being around others. That is a normal, healthy state of functioning. But sometimes we are faced with a stressor that causes us to react. This is also very, very normal, where we're a little uncomfortable, we're irritable, we're impatient. We've all had something happen at work before. Maybe we can think back to when we were in school and the stressors that we had there. We come home, we're just not in a really good mood. This is a normal part of being a human being too. Sometimes we get nervous, sad, we worry, especially if we've got kind of a major stressor coming down the pipeline that we're worried about. We may have a hard time sleeping, lowered energy, difficulty relaxing. This can just be thought of as going through a hard time, as we would say, which is just a normal part of being a human being. And whenever we're healthy, whenever we're having some reactions to some negative things going on in the environment, really all we need to be well is good self-care. So taking care of our body, taking care of our mind and our spirit, but also social support and connection with other people. And generally, as long as we have those two things, as long as we're taking care of ourselves and we're connecting with people when they need them, we can overcome some of those obstacles and go back to a healthy state of functioning. When it's time to seek professional care is when we kind of move down the continuum here a little bit. So you might be injured by something. And what I mean by injured is psychologically injured. Maybe you've suffered a trauma of some kind and you're really struggling weeks to months after that traumatic event happens. And you're feeling a lot of anger and anxiety. You've got this sadness that just won't go away no matter how hard you try. You're preoccupied with what's happened to you, or your anxiety is so severe that you just can't work through it with some of the strategies that we're talking about today. You're having a hard time sleeping and that's not getting better, and you're starting to avoid people and withdraw. This is a time when it might be time to consider that you need some professional help. And then we have this concept called mental illness. This is where we're talking about a clinical disorder that has to be diagnosed by a licensed mental health professional. So like a licensed professional counselor, a psychologist, a psychiatrist. And when we're talking about mental illness, we're talking about a significant difficulty with managing your emotions. You've got a high level of anxiety, panic attacks. Maybe you're always depressed. It never seems to lift or get better. Sometimes people will have what we would call a disturbed or unattached contact with reality, which means that they are hearing or seeing things that others don't hear or see, what we would call hallucinations. They might have some bizarre behaviors that sometimes keep them unsafe or get them into trouble. And certainly if a person is having suicidal thoughts or behavior, they need help right away to treat those thoughts of suicide and get the help that they need. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go forward today. But big point of this graphic is our mental health is always in a state of flux. And most of the time we're over here where we're healthy, or we might react to something. But when it moves beyond that and the signs and symptoms get more severe, that's a time to reach out and seek professional help. Now, there are going to be some things that are completely normal. Sometimes after we lose somebody or lose something that's important to us, we go through the grief process. And when we are grieving, it is absolutely normal to experience intense sadness for weeks, sometimes months, often years after we've lost that person. That's absolutely normal. We're going to talk about the dividing line there a little bit when it's time to seek help. But with grief especially, it's not unusual years down the road to experience a memory or hear a song or read a poem that reminds us of the person that we lost. And all of those emotions kind of come flooding back. That is absolutely normal. Sometimes really scary, terrifying things happen to us. Sometimes we feel like we are going to be injured, or we fear our own death as a result of this horrific traumatic thing. And it is absolutely normal for a few weeks after something happens to us to have a general sense of anxiety and terror, to have a hard time sleeping. That's absolutely normal. After something traumatic happens, we generally don't recommend seeking professional help from a licensed mental health professional for about 4 to 6 weeks, simply because it is so normal to experience that anxiety and the difficulty sleeping and problems with your startle reflex after that happens. After 4 to 6 weeks, though, if we are still struggling with some of those signs and symptoms, it's time to reach out and seek professional help. It is absolutely normal to feel sad from time to time, absolutely normal to feel angry every now and then. And the thing about anger is it often gets a bad rap as an emotion. We usually think of anger as a very negative thing to feel. We shouldn't feel angry. I'm going to disagree with that, simply because sometimes anger serves a purpose. It lets us know when somebody has committed an injustice. It lets us know when somebody has broken one of our boundaries. The problem with anger is we sometimes don't channel our anger very well, and we behave in ways that get us into trouble. So anger, we absolutely want to be accepting of. Even when our kids are angry, it is okay to say, I see that you're really angry right now, and that's okay. But set firm boundaries with regard to that behavior, because we all get angry every now and then. It's also completely normal to feel really, really excited about something that you're looking forward to. But no matter what, I want to get rid of this one word right here. I wish I could delete it from our language. No matter what, there is no such thing as crazy. And that brings me to the discussion of this word right here. I said this earlier, we have a problem with stigma, especially here in Texas, where we live, where we kind of have this bootstrap mentality, this idea that if I'm struggling with depression or anxiety, I should just be able to pull myself up by my bootstraps. I don't need anybody's help. And one of my goals as a mental health professional is to do what I can to do away with that stigma. What we mean by stigma, these are negative attitudes about people that we view, that we see as being different from us. And sometimes this includes, unfortunately, people who struggle with a mental health challenge, people who struggle with a disability, and people who have certain health conditions. And we view them as bizarre or other from us. Maybe we stare at them when we are out in public. Whatever the case may be, it's a negative attitude about those folks. And sometimes those attitudes lead to active discrimination. So name calling. So we use these words like crazy or retarded that can be really, really damaging. And there's a whole list that I could list here that are just totally damaging. And we really need to try to eliminate those words from our vocabulary. And I think a way that we can all get started is when you hear people using these words, while it might make you really uncomfortable to confront them, I think we have to say, hey, that word isn't okay with me, and I really wish you would stop using it. Because these individuals are often left out of activities. They are stereotyped. People make assumptions about who they are because of what groups they belong to. And we attach these really, really harmful labels to them. And really, we just need to do what we can to stop that. So what I'd like to do is kind of change our language a little bit. If we're not going to use words like crazy or retarded or whatever horrible word we can think of, this is what we want to do instead. So you'll hear this a lot in mental health circles, this person first language. I'm a big fan of just kind of acknowledging what people wish to be called and using that. But generally speaking, instead of saying, oh, Bob is a schizophrenic, or he's a psycho, or he's a schizo, or something to that effect, we want to say Bob, person first, who is diagnosed with schizophrenia, or Bill, who is diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, or Susan, who has been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Using that first person language kind of detaches them from that label a little bit, and it can be really, really helpful to our conversations about mental health. We could also, instead of saying normal or abnormal or weird or abnormal, instead use words like neurotypical. So I, Greg Hickey, having never been diagnosed with a mental health condition or an autism spectrum disorder, I would consider myself to be neurotypical. I am similar to most of the population in terms of my ability to think and feel and behave in a healthy, functioning way. We might also refer to somebody as neurodivergent if they don't fit that bill. Somebody who has ADHD, somebody who has been diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder, we would say they are neurodivergent. You might also hear the word neurodiverse, which is a word used to describe a population of people, a group of people who have varying kinds of functioning and ways of thinking and disability or non-disability. We would say that that's a neurodiverse population, which we would love to see more neurodiversity, I think, in schools and in workplaces. We might also talk about suicide as well. And I told you we were going to talk about this a little bit today. When somebody dies by suicide, a lot of times we will use this other word, committed suicide. I'm going to ask you guys, let me turn this back on y'all. What would be wrong with the phrasing committed suicide? What's wrong with that word committed? Y'all can put it in the chat or speak it out loud. What's wrong with using committed suicide to describe suicides?
I would say it sounds self-inflicted, like he did something to him, something bad to himself.
Yeah. What other kinds of things do we tend to commit?
Commit crimes, I don't know, somebody else help me out here.
Yeah.
I was thinking crimes. too.
Crimes, yeah, that's the most common one. Sometimes people will say committed adultery, committed a sin,
Yes.
kind of associate it with this really negative thing. Now, we certainly don't want to associate suicide with positive things, but what we have found is when we're working with people who have lost somebody to suicide, when we start using the word committed, they feel as though their loved one committed a crime or they did something really dirty or fraudulent or horrible. And they may certainly feel that way, but what we find a gentler way to discuss somebody's death by suicide is to simply use that phrasing. They died by suicide. They didn't commit it. They died by it. And honestly, a lot of people believe that suicide is a crime. That's a myth. At least in Texas, it is not a crime to take your own life. So we kind of shift the language there a little bit, but again, we want to eliminate words like crazy, retarded, schizo, junkie, psycho, all of these horrible things that we tend to refer to people who struggle with mental health challenges. So my challenge to you guys is to try to shift your language there a little bit. So what may require professional help? We've talked a little bit about what's normal. Now let's kind of get into what do we need to be looking for. So there's some common mental health difficulties that are likely going to require a professional. So somebody who might be diagnosed with major depression. Again, this is just beyond normal sadness. This is a period, about 2 weeks or more, of intense sadness that doesn't go away no matter how hard you try, all day, nearly every day, a loss of interest in activities, a kind of slowing of your physical being, so you're not moving around as normal, sleeping too much or sleeping too little, appetite changes. There's a whole list of symptoms there. And if it's as severe as it starts out being for more than 2 weeks, that's when we typically say it's time to go speak to somebody and see what's going on here, especially if it's a depression that just kind of comes out of nowhere. Exposure to trauma might, in about 10% of cases, lead to a diagnosis of what's called post-traumatic stress disorder. And so if somebody is struggling with intense symptoms related to trauma, if they are overly anxious, irritable, angry, if they startle really easily, if they're having trouble sleeping because of nightmares, if they are avoiding interactions with people and going to certain places, avoiding things that remind them of the trauma, and it's really starting to impact their life. If we are beyond 4 to 6 weeks after the trauma, that's about the time we recommend going and seeking some professional help. Of course, any exaggerated fears or anxiety that don't go away with those normal social supports that we were talking about. Thoughts of suicide, this is absolutely an emergency. There is no time frame that you should wait to get somebody help for thoughts of suicide. We're not talking about, well, let it go on for 2 or 3 weeks. If somebody is having thoughts of suicide, please ask directly, are you having thoughts of suicide? And if they are, get them immediately to some of the emergency resources that we're going to talk about towards the end today. And of course, what we would call self-injury. These are things like cutting or burning your body or otherwise purposefully doing tissue damage to your body. Lots of reasons why somebody might engage in cutting behavior. Most of the time, when you ask somebody what they like about cutting themselves, they will tell you that it helps them relieve stress. If they are feeling numb, it helps them feel something, even if it's pain. Sometimes people can become addicted to the pain that they feel when cutting themselves. If somebody is cutting themselves, that is almost always a sign that they need some professional help for finding better ways to manage their emotions and have some new behaviors that give them that relief, because cutting can be very, very damaging and it can become very dangerous. While people who cut aren't always suicidal, it does increase their risk for suicide for a number of reasons, but chief among them, sometimes if you are to cut too deep, that can do a lot of damage. You can cut an artery, really, really injure yourself. So we want to make sure that those individuals get the help that they need too. So if you recognize some of these things, that is certainly a sign that we need to reach out and get professional help. So specific signs to look for, I've got them listed here. Again, that intense, sad mood most of the day, nearly every day. They just aren't interested in previously enjoyable activities. So if we are talking about children and adults, this could be a hobby, it could be work, it could be school, all of those things that we take an interest in every day. If that goes away, that's kind of the chief sign that we are struggling with the depression. Sometimes people who are depressed talk very negatively about themselves. They kind of personalize everything, take a lot of things personally, but they have these beliefs about themselves sometimes that nobody loves them, people would be better off without them, that nothing they do is right, they can never do anything right. They also believe that others sometimes aren't going to be helpful. They believe that things aren't going to get better no matter what they do. So if you hear some of that negative self-talk, that could also be a sign. Isolation and withdrawal. So when we are feeling depressed, we don't really want to be around others. So we withdraw physically and emotionally from those people around us, especially if some of these things are out of the usual. It's certainly a sign that you need to pay attention and start asking some questions. Sudden shifts in mood beyond what is usual. So if you see a lot of mood swings and mood changes, that might be a sign that a person is struggling. Explosive behaviors that just don't respond to your efforts. And so if you have tried really, really hard to help your child manage their behavior and it's just not getting better, that's a sign that you might need some professional help to learn some more effective ways of doing that. And with mental health, one of the first things to go is our hygiene care. And so somebody who is struggling with depression, or I suppose an intense anxiety, or they're struggling with a trauma that they've been exposed to, if they are really, really struggling, they may start to not bathe or shower as often, if at all, brush their teeth. They may not be grooming themselves, their hair as much as they used to. And so if you see changes in hygiene, that can also be a sign we need to pay attention. Of course, fears and exaggerated anxieties. If we are having nightmares that are going on and on and on and disrupting our sleep, and we're not able to sleep as well as we should be able to, certainly a sign that we need to get professional help there. If you just you have a sense of feeling numb or detached from your surroundings, if you struggle with intense episodes of panic where seemingly out of nowhere you're your chest starts hurting and your heart starts pounding and you have problems breathing and you break out into a cold sweat and there's no medical reason for why this is happening, it may be a sign that you're struggling with panic symptoms. And sometimes that requires a professional to help you learn how to better manage those. Certainly, if we are engaging in unhealthy coping, like I said, your mental health changes day to day. And one of the big components that affects your mental health are the stressful situations you find yourself in every day. And sometimes people cope with that stress in ways that aren't very healthy. So especially in our teenagers, sometimes we see, due to some peer exposure, alcohol and drug use, risk-taking behaviors, sexual promiscuity early on as a way to cope in an unhealthy way, albeit with whatever stressors that they are going through. So if we start to see some of that unhealthy coping in our kids and in our loved ones, certainly time to reach out and seek help. Persistent and inappropriate self-blame as well. And we see this a lot in children who are children of divorce, where they feel like they are to blame for the children's or for the parents' divorce. We also see a lot of shame and self-blame in trauma survivors. So if they have been through a trauma that involved somebody else doing something to them, whether it was a sexual violation or a physical violation, a lot of times trauma survivors will blame themselves for what happened. They will believe that there's something they could have done to fend off the attacker or prevent the act of violence that affected them, when in reality, if we were to take a closer look at that, there was nothing really that they could have done. And so if we see kids kind of blaming themselves, and adults really, for things that they couldn't control, and that doesn't seem to get better, sometimes a psychotherapist can really help with some of that. A little bit about suicide specifically. This is something that is really important to me because it is such an emergency condition. Some signs that we want to look for. Certainly, if the person is talking about suicide, we want to take every mention of suicide seriously. Even if we think they're just joking about it or kidding about it, what we find when you look at the research, the way we all deal with really difficult stuff sometimes is to use our sense of humor. And so if somebody is joking about suicide, we want to get serious about it. And when you spot some of these signs that I have listed up here, please ask directly, are you having thoughts of suicide? You are not going to put the idea in their head. There has been a lot of research done about this. If you ask somebody about suicide, you're not going to give them the idea that it's okay. You are not encouraging it. You're opening the door to a conversation that they may not have previously felt was open to them. And what we find is if you ask directly about suicide, they're going to be more likely to be honest about it. So I won't go down the line on these signs. Y'all are perfectly capable of reading those things. But certainly if they are talking about suicide, if we see them writing about it, making drawings about it, if we get the sense that they feel like they're a burden to others or that things just aren't going to get better, certainly a sign that we need to start asking these questions. Other things to pay attention to, and these signs are a little more subtle, if they start to give away their prized possessions to people, so maybe they're handing off their letter jacket or their class ring, something that they would never otherwise give away. And certainly if, in addition to all of these things, they kind of have a sense of calm, they seem to be at peace, a lot of times that means that the person who winds up taking their own life has reached a level of comfort with the idea. And it's a sign that we need to reach out and start asking those direct questions. So that said, what is a mental illness and disorder? We've got a pretty good sense of it so far. It is a condition that I will say deeply impacts a person's thinking and their behaviors and their mood. All of those things that we consider a part of our mental health are affected. And then we have a hard time functioning at home, work, and school. And so I've got a list of common mental illnesses there that we've talked somewhat about: the major depressive disorder, anxiety and panic disorders, PTSD, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, and also what we would call thought disorders. These are things like schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and others that kind of have a loss of contact with reality at their core. So this could include those hallucinations we spoke about. That could be what we would call delusions. So delusions are essentially ideas that just aren't very well grounded in reality. and they are really, really extreme. And so we might have delusions of grandeur. So feeling like I am God or a God and other people are my subjects, or I might have delusions of persecution, which is the feeling that others are out to get me, kind of a sense of paranoia, all kinds of different delusions out there that might characterize a thought disorder. And also substance use disorders, where somebody's substance use has become really problematic and has started impacting their thinking, their behaviors, and their ability to function. So a couple that I want to hone in on, because we are here primarily to help the kids that we work with, whether they're our children or students. I want to talk a little bit about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And if you are not familiar with ADHD, there are a few signs and symptoms that, if intense enough, merit a diagnosis. So we have behaviors like excitability, restlessness, hyperactivity, and impulsivity, a lack of restraint. You also have a thinking component to ADHD. So individuals with ADHD are often described as kind of being absent-minded. They have a hard time focusing their attention. They can sometimes be very forgetful and just generally have a hard time keeping their attention focused. But there are also some mood components too, like anger and anxiety. They tend to be a little more prone towards boredom if they don't have enough stimulation, and also can experience some mood swings. So I don't want to get too tangled up in the signs of ADHD, but what I do want to caution is that it is one of the most overdiagnosed mental health challenges. And in excess of about 15 to 20% of students, especially boys, are going to be referred for ADHD testing at some point in their academic career. But what we would call the diagnostic prevalence, just how prevalent is this in a general population of people, is only about 4%. Only about 4% of children would qualify for an ADHD diagnosis. The reason why this is we don't often control for certain very important factors. What we don't control for are things that increase inattentiveness in children, like how much screen time they get per day. So studies are actually demonstrating now that more than 2 hours per day of screen time actually leads to an increase in inattentiveness, impulsivity, and hyperactivity, not just in kids, but in adults too. Studies also demonstrate that if we are exposed to screen time 2 hours before bedtime, we actually decrease our body's ability to produce what's called melatonin, which is our body's natural sleep aid. And that leads to non-restorative and non-restful sleep. And so we're starting to learn some things about screen time and inattentiveness that are kind of concerning. So what do we do to combat this? What we really need, before we jump on the ADHD bandwagon and just assume that our kid has ADHD, let's try to strike a balance on some of these things. Let's try to cut screen time at least an hour before bed. And yes, your child is going to protest this. They're going to hate this idea. But you are the parent and you have the right to say, you know what, we're going to cut screen time an hour before bed because it's just not healthy for you. And do what you can to limit screen time throughout the day as much as possible. I'm not saying that your child cannot have their screen time or play their video games, but we have to do all things in moderation. Simply knowing that the more hours they spend in front of a screen increases their problems with focus and attention should be enough to lead us to try to limit that as much as we can. Minimize or eliminate caffeine and sugary drinks after the early afternoon hours. Beyond 3 o'clock, that caffeine and that sugar still stays in your system, and your kiddo is not going to get the sleep, the restful sleep that they need as a result of that. Of course, be attentive to diet if we can. Make sure that our child is eating the rainbow, as they say, proteins, grains, vegetables, fruits. Try to keep that balanced diet because that can impact our mental health and our physical and mental well-being. Make sure that your child is getting an appropriate amount of exercise. I would say at least an hour of movement-based activity per day so that they're burning off that little kid energy that they've got. They have somewhere to expel that energy, and they'll be less excitable and a little more focused throughout the day if they're getting that exercise. And of course, I can't stress structure enough. Consistent bedtimes, consistent bedtime routines, sometimes giving a warning to your child, hey, you've got about 5 minutes and then we're going to go get your teeth brushed, get you in the bath and get you to bed. Give them little time warnings indicating that, hey, we're reaching that point in the evening. where it's time to get you ready for bed. And ditto with wake times. Waking up early enough to have time to get out of the house, get out the front door, and keep those sleep times and wake times as consistent as possible. Autism spectrum disorders, or just what we would call ASDs, these are developmental disabilities that cause some significant social and emotional and communication and behavior challenges. And really, with autism spectrum disorders, every child's experience of an ASD is so unique that they will tell you, if you've met one child with an autism spectrum disorder, you've met one child with autism spectrum disorder. There are so many experiences of this, and it's so widely varied. But generally speaking, what we find in individuals who have an ASD is that they have a hard time in some of these areas, whether it's learning or thinking or problem solving. There's going to be a range of these things. There are going to be individuals with autism spectrum disorders who are extremely gifted, and then there are going to be those who are profoundly limited by some of those problems that they have. They may have difficulty with changes in routine. People who have an autism spectrum disorder are generally very concrete thinkers. Not always, but many of them are. And they may have very different ways of paying attention, learning new things. And we see the earliest sign appearing at around 18 to 2 years old. So here are some signs from the CDC of an autism spectrum disorder. So when they are little, maybe they don't point at objects to show interest around the age of 2 years old or so. So they're not pointing at an airplane flying. They are just kind of seemingly disinterested in it. They may not look at objects when another person points at them. So they aren't following or tracking you whenever you're pointing at things. They may have a hard time relating to other people, or just seemingly don't have much of an interest in others at all. They may have a hard time with eye contact. They may want to spend a little more time alone. And certainly one of the issues that we see as they get old enough to communicate about emotions, they may have a little more trouble understanding other people's feelings, being able to put words on their own feelings. That is something that we call alexithymia. Alexithymia is essentially the ability to put words on our emotions and label and understand where those emotions are coming from. Individuals with autism spectrum disorders may prefer not to be held or cuddled. They might cuddle only when they want to, and they may generally appear unaware when people talk to them. So those social cues, not responding to some of those social cues, is one of the key signs that we tend to look for. People with an ASD may also have problems with what we call sensory processing. So they may react differently, sometimes a little more strongly, to sensory inputs. So they may be very photosensitive. They may experience loud noises as very terrifying and overwhelming. They may have some tactile difficulties, so feeling clothing against their skin. If anybody's ever had, when you put on a pair of socks, the little knot on either end of your sock kind of rubbing against your toe, I have met many children who, with tactile sensory issues, that is their big complaint, is just the discomfort of the socks on your feet. So we sometimes see that in individuals with an ASD as well. So just some more signs here. They may be very interested in people, but just don't know how to talk or play with them, having a hard time expressing their needs. They may be very repetitive in their actions and their speech. So they may repeat certain phrases over and over again, or certain actions over and over again. Sometimes they struggle with changes in routine. So very important when working with children who have an ASD, that we try to keep routine as stable as possible. And if that routine is going to change, we start preparing them early on for that routine change. So whole list of signs and symptoms there. With regard to help with these, I've got some resources listed toward the end of the presentation today. There is no cure for autism spectrum disorder. In fact, there's a growing movement that we need to start thinking about the gifts and the talents and the new ways of thinking that individuals with ASDs bring to the table, and stop thinking about it in terms of whether we can make it go away or not. That is what I meant earlier by treasuring neurodiversity in our population. But we can, if an autism spectrum disorder greatly disrupts your behavior and your ability to function, provide some social and life skills training. If we have an issue with speech, which sometimes happens with these kiddos, we can do physical or speech therapy to help improve their ability to communicate verbally. There is a type of behavior called applied behavioral analysis that kind of helps with some challenging behaviors. And again, I've got some resources that toward the end, if you have a child in your life who struggles with an ASD, might be helpful for you. So what can you do to start this conversation? So we've talked so far about recognizing signs, what is typical, what is atypical. So I will say this, in all things, be a validating and compassionate presence. And what I mean by that is just simply when you're engaging in a conversation with a child about mental health or really anything else, make sure that we got the phones put away, that we are focused solely on the conversation at hand. With your body posture, in all things, keep it open and welcoming, especially if you have a kiddo who's kind of prone to getting really anxious or tense or even angry. And may have a difficulty with lashing out behaviors. The reason why we focus so much on keeping our body posture open and welcoming and keeping our vocal tone nice and warm and smooth and calming is that if a child is dysregulated, that is, they are reacting, they are engaging in behaviors that can hurt themselves or hurt somebody else, if you are calm and you are communicating with your body and your voice to them that you are calm, they are going to regulate to you. They're going to match you. We do this a lot with other people in our lives. Has anybody ever gone like out of state and you visit your relatives, and if you have an accent and your family has a stronger accent than you kind of pick up their accent a little bit? I have family who live in Louisiana. I have never lived in Louisiana in my life. And when I come back, I sound like I just crawled out of the bayou. I have a very strong, like I actually pick up a Louisiana accent when I'm there. And that's because I spent so much time in conversation with them, regulating to them, and we kind of match each other there. So the idea is if you are calm and collected when working with your kiddo and you are validating and compassionate, they're going to return that to you. We tend to match each other when we're conversing with each other. Notice the next time you're talking to a colleague, kind of how y'all match each other when you're communicating. So one of the ways I like to describe your vocal tone is the late night FM DJ voice. This was actually an idea posed by Chris Voss. He's a former FBI negotiator and was for decades. And so this was a man who literally had to negotiate the release of hostages. And he says, you know, when I am negotiating, I use my late night FM DJ voice. And when you think about a late night FM DJ, I think about Dr. Drew and Loveline. So if you listen to him like 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night, you're listening to Loveline with Dr. Drew on 94.7 Kixie FM, blah, 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 blah. His voice never got agitated, got loud. He kept it right there, just warm, smooth, and calming. So channel your inner late night radio FM DJ voice and keep that calm, warm vocal tone. And that's about the place you need to be whenever you're entering into a negotiation or a conversation with your child whenever they are struggling. So start the conversation. If you notice that your child or somebody that you love is struggling, just a simple, I've noticed lately that you're really down, you seem really sad, and you've been withdrawing a lot lately, and that's not normal for you. What's up? What's going on there? Just asking that what's up is very conversational. It's informal. And then engage in just basic active listening. Listen to understand what they're going through, not to respond, because sometimes we do that. When somebody is talking to us, we're not listening to truly understand what they're going through. We're already preparing a response in our head. Summarize occasionally. We don't have to parrot exactly what they tell us. We don't want to do it word for word. That can be kind of annoying, but just give them a summary every now and then. So I hear you're saying you're really sad today because, you know, your friends can't go out and play and you're really bored. You know, that makes sense to me why you would feel that way. So what I just did there was validate. This is the language of validation. And for those of you who are married or romantically involved, I'm going to tell you right now, the language of validation has saved more marriages, more couples, from crashing against the rocks than anything that I have seen. The power of this top phrase right here, that makes sense to me. You know, it makes sense why you would be angry today. I think I would be really angry or sad or disappointed if that happened to me. That is really powerful. That is showing that you are bearing witness to somebody's struggle, whether it's your child, your spouse, your coworker, your friends, your family. I think we could all stand to be a little more validating of each other. And I think that we also need to offer hope too. You know what? I think we can get through this together. Hearing that out loud, this idea that now I'm part of a team with you, can really give us a lot of hope. It can be very validating. But sometimes what we do, especially if we're in a rush, if we're stressed out, if we just don't have time to have this conversation today, is we get really judgmental. So we want to avoid these things in red. It's not that big of a deal, or you're acting like such a baby. Oh, you're just being so stupid today. Calm down. Has anybody been angry before and been told to calm down? Never in the history of telling people to calm down has telling people to calm down ever worked. Like it just escalates things. Sure, we want them to calm down, certainly respectable, but the way to do that is to be calm, to be compassionate, to be validating, and that in and of itself is calming, and it takes a lot of practice. So as you are talking to your child or your loved one about what they're going through, again, offer those occasional summaries. So you're feeling really angry today because Javier called your sister an ugly name. You know what? I think I would be angry in that situation too. You know, like that really makes sense to me why you'd be angry. You're just validating. That's all you're doing. Ask open-ended questions. This shows that you're interested and it gets you some more information. Can you tell me more about that? What led you to think that way? When that happened, what was going through your mind? Well, and then what happened? Tell me more. What were you thinking and feeling when Billy took your toy away from you? What else do you think I need to know about this problem right now? And if you're confused about something, or if you've kind of identified a mismatch in what they're telling you versus what you know happened, instead of calling them a liar or you're fibbing to me or, you know, whatever the case may be, you know, I'm really confused. I don't quite understand. I noticed this, but you're telling me this. Like, what's going on there? See what you did there? You didn't call them a liar. You didn't insult them, but you did kind of point out that you saw a mismatch in what they communicated. In all things, be mindful of your own mood and recognize whether or not you are in a calm space, and recognize that your emotional expression is going to set the tone for conversations about mental health. If you're not in a calm space, they're going to pick up on your agitation. But if you are calm and you are collected, you take a moment to kind of breathe deeply, that's going to be returned to you. Also, encourage questions, be a source of information, an open book for them. But sometimes you're not going to have all of the information. Be willing to say, you know what? I don't know. I don't have an answer for you. That is a great opportunity to model what we would just call uncertainty tolerance. I can tolerate not having the answers. And if I don't have the answers, I can also research some fact-based information. And so this is a great opportunity to say, you know what? I don't have a good answer for you. Let's look it up together. Let's take a moment to look up the answer, whatever that might be. And that's great modeling, because so many times, instead of saying we don't know, we just make something up, and it winds up being really, really damaging. In all things, be reassuring. We're going to talk about some supports as we close today, and always maintain that coping focus, focusing on coping skills, exploring ways that you guys can cope together. And I love the question, you know, what can I do to be helpful? What does support from me look like? So I always like to try to open the door to what we call stinking thinking. So there are always some thoughts and images that lie beneath our emotions. And sometimes we can reality check some of those really troubling thoughts. And so if a kid comes to you and they kind of imagine a really horrible thing happening, we can say, you know, that's really interesting. You know, that sounds really anxiety provoking. How likely is that to happen? What led you to think that way? What have you seen? What have you heard that tells you that that really awful thing is going to happen? So now we're kind of having a conversation about anxiety and the really scary things that they can imagine happening. And instead, sometimes we try to shut that down. Well, that's just ridiculous. It's not going to happen. Why would you think that's going to happen? But sometimes if we ask kids about their worst case scenarios, we really learn kind of what's going on in their head, and we can defuse some of that really problematic thinking. Some kids may not be used to trusting an adult. So if kids are used to really unhelpful discipline, or they're not used to people talking to them like this and being so validating and caring, there are some things that you can say that might help rebuild trust. So, you know, I'm not here to try to tell you what to do. You're not in trouble. I'm not mad at you. If there is a child who is used to the adults in their life being really, really angry with them when they misbehave, they may not be used to somebody trying to actually help them figure this stuff out. So to have an adult say, I'm not mad at you, I just want to talk. I just want us to talk a little bit about what's going on. I'm only trying to understand what you're going through, but also respecting to a degree if they don't want to talk about it that day. You know, I want to talk about this with you, but I'm okay with waiting until you're ready. You're teaching them that you respect their boundaries. And I think that we don't do enough of respecting children's boundaries. We want them to do what we want them to do. We're going to coerce them into doing it. But they're people just like us. They start setting boundaries early on, and we should do what we can within limits to respect those. And if we have misstepped before with the children that we work with, whether they're our own kids or students of ours, it is okay to apologize and recognize that your communication previously was really regrettable. So you can say, I know that what we're doing right now is different from what we used to do. And I recognize we kind of got off on the wrong foot. I want to try some new things with you. Would that be okay? And modeling that kind of apologetic behavior, I think, is also really important. We can also be restorative in our communication. So I gave you some ideas here for that. So you can just simply say, hey, let's talk. I've noticed XYZ. What's up? If we are trying to correct a behavior, important that we always do that in private. We can use that open-ended questioning we talked about, but I really like to steer away from this question. Why did you do that? 98% of the time, kids do not know why they did what they did. Instead, you can ask some restorative questions like, what happened? What were you thinking and feeling whenever you got angry? Who did your behavior affect and how so? But also, if we're trying to process what I would just call a regrettable incident with a kid where they engaged in a behavior that was harmful, we can ask them after a period of time passes and they calm down, what have you been thinking since? And that can be really, really powerful. So in the interest of time, I do want to go, I'll send you the rest of the slideshow, which is just jam-packed with different recommendations for communication. I do want to get to the part where we talk about what help looks like in our region before we leave today, because I know we're kind of coming up on time. We do have a master resource list that is packed full of basic needs resources and mental health resources. And we have those available to you. You can use it, print it off, do what you need to. It's also got all the way down to private mental health providers. We also have local mental health authorities. We have 4 that serve our region, and I have them listed here that can provide all kinds of different things like psychiatric evaluations and screenings. They have some wraparound services. Their criteria for admission can be really, really tight. Most of the individuals they help qualify for Medicaid and Medicare, and they do have assistance with those applications. West Texas Counseling and Guidance is a major psychotherapy resource in our region, and I've listed their number here. They offer all of their services on a sliding scale based on income, housing size. They use cognitive behavioral therapy to treat things like depression and anxiety and trauma. They work with kids and adults. And if there is a person in your life who is struggling with thoughts of suicide, whether it is a kid or an adult, they can typically get you in that business day really, really quickly. They've got some therapists on standby who can do really good crisis work. Talked about autism spectrum disorders today. I have listed their numbers here. The ABC Center, the San Angelo Autism Center, Blue Sprig, and Empower Behavioral Health. Those are kind of the major autism spectrum disorder resources in our community. Your school also has access to a Texas Child Health Access Through Telemedicine program, but the superintendent of your school system has to sign a memorandum or a contract in order to receive these free of charge services in your school. If your school is not connected to the TCHAP program, this might be a point of advocacy for you as a parent, as an educator, so that kids have on-site mental health psychiatry and telehealth at their disposal. If you have any questions about the TCHAP program, I'm on a first name basis with all of our program's leadership, and I can help get your school connected to this program so that kids can receive those free psychiatry and telehealth services. Rivercrest Hospital, if we are talking about a psychiatric emergency, they are I think the only hospital in Region 15 that serves children and adolescents. I've got their number and their information listed here. They bill most major insurances. They do inpatient and outpatient work with children and adolescents and adults. So a really good resource there. I've listed important hotlines here, like the suicide hotline, which actually just moved to a 3-digit number. So much like 911, now you can call 988 and connect immediately with the suicide hotline. They've also got a text line, text home to 741-741, and listed some other resources there for you. Y'all, I have enjoyed my time with you guys today. There was some stuff in the slide deck that we just didn't have time to cover today, but really what it was just more about communication. So I would love to be able to send that those slides out to all of you guys so that you have them. You've got those communication pointers. And if you guys ever have any questions, I have listed our staff and our emails here, our phone number. You can always reach out, whether you are an educator or a parent, and ask some of these important questions that you have. And so I can stick around for a couple of minutes, but you might have somewhere you need to go. So I certainly understand.
Thank you, Greg, so much.
Yeah.
I'm